to go whenever you are.
Okay, I think we have a quorum, so I don't think we do have a quorum, so I'll call the meeting to order at this point. Can I have an approval of the agenda?
So moved.
Second by Ian.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion carried. Does anybody have any conflict of interest with the agenda that's before them this afternoon? Hearing none, I'm going to say there's nothing there, so we can go to number 4, year-end projections and fund transfers. Mary Kay, are you ready?
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay,
I'm just going to take a minute and share my screen.
sure.
Everybody see that okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So the Regional Service Delivery Act requires that any reserve fund transfers for the current fiscal year be made by December 31st. So staff takes November's actual results. We project out what we think December will look like to come up with a projection for 2021. And then we make recommendations for reserve fund transfers based on that. So that's where we are today. We're making those recommendations to the Finance Committee, which then decides whether to forward those on to the board. And if they are in agreement with these recommendations, the board would receive this report and they would vote on these reserve fund transfers on Thursday evening. So that's the background for you. So I will go through the various divisions and I will walk you through what the actual results are for the end of November, where we expect December to land, and then what the 2021 will look like if those projections pan out. I always like to give the caveat that these are projections. They will be different than the actuals will be different than what we project, but we expect not significant variances from what we're projecting. So getting right into the numbers, starting with the Regional Planning Services Division. So the actual column to the end of November, the Regional Planning Services has a surplus of just under 31,000. For the month of December, we are expecting to have a deficit just because our expenses are going to run a little bit higher likely than our revenue sources. So the deficit for December is expected to be around 5,500, leaving a projected surplus for the entire year of just over 25,000. And you can see what's led to that surplus is the savings over here in expenses. We didn't have anything for regional planning and our corporate services are running under budget. So because we do not have any reserve fund requirements for this fund, what we've done in the past and what we're recommending this year is allow this surplus to flow through to our 2023 budget. We'll get credit for it then, and no transfer resolutions are required by the board to accomplish this. Is there any questions on this division? Right, I will keep going. So the next division to look at is our Planning and Development Division. So for the end of November, no surprise here, we are in a deficit position. It's just under 11,000. We have talked about this numerous times at the Finance Committee. We did expect planning to have a deficit for 2021. You'll recall we did have to employ an additional building inspector because of changes to the building code. So because of that, we were expecting a deficit. Now it's much less than what it could have been. You'll see when I go through the detail on the expenses, we were able to have some savings. So I want to say great job to management for handling those costs and being able to have some savings in areas to help balance out that unexpected cost of the additional employee. So for December, we're expecting to have a deficit of just under 1,600, adding those two together. To the end of December, we're expecting to have a deficit for 2021 of 12,567,000 roughly. So what's led to that? Obviously, we talked about on the expense side, we did have an additional employee, so you can see that overage, but you do see some savings here as well. So management has done a good job with cost control because our projected overage and expenses is only about 29,000, which is less than what the cost of the additional employee was. In addition, we also had some additional revenue sources. You can see here, other services are about 19,000 higher than what we had budgeted. So what are we going to do about this deficit? We do have an operating reserve fund for planning. It has $25,000 in it currently. It's fully funded in accordance with our policies. So what we're recommending is to take 15,000 out of that operating reserve, transfer it into the planning and development operating fund, which would leave then a small surplus in the operating fund of about $2,400. It would also leave about 10,000 in that reserve fund for future years. And then we would look to build that reserve fund back up over the next couple of years in our budget. Any questions on the planning and development division? All right, moving along, we come to the solid waste division. So this is just a summary. We'll get into the details afterwards. But as you know, solid waste is broken down by landfill and recycling internally. So the landfill produces the surplus, the recycling does have a deficit. And then at the end of the day, you come up with your total solid waste surplus or deficit. So before considering any transfers, we're projecting to have a surplus of just under $99,000 for the year. And we'll get into the details as we go into the next couple pages. So on the landfill side, to the end of November, we have a surplus of $1,021,000. For December, there are a lot of adjustments that do go through in the month of December. So we're estimating a deficit for December in the range of about $307,000, which would then leave us with a surplus for 2021 of about $714,000 for the landfill side of things. So what's driving that? We've had significant amount of tonnage come in. We're projecting to be about 81,000 tons for the year. That's almost 2,000 tons higher than what we had budgeted. And that's not a level that we typically see if it's not a flood year. So it was a really good year in terms of tonnage coming in. Construction and demolition were also higher than what we had budgeted. And then we have some other sources of income, which would be like our ash, our toll gate. Those are slightly over budget to the tune of about 80,000. This does not include any transfers from the reserve, so that's why you're seeing this amount. So if we don't consider this 250,000, our revenues on the landfill are actually about $289,000 above what we had budgeted. They're projected to be anyway. And then on the expense side, we do have some savings and we do have some overages. So we'll start with the overages. In administration costs, we are running over our budget. Areas that are driving that would be our professional fees. We did incur significant expenses related to our EIA approval. So that's driving the overage and administration costs, as well as the HST, the non-refundable portion. We did have the $700,000 dewatering project on the cells that the board approved back in April. That's included in our capital expenditures. So HST on that, that's non-refundable, again, is driving some of that administration costs as well. Post-closing expenses are over as well, and that relates to a year-end adjustment that we have to record in order to get the liability to where it should be. On the savings side of things, we can see that our equipment costs are under by about 200,000, and we expect baler expenses to be under by about 280,000. So overall, when you add all the expenses up, we had about $155,000 in overages in expenses, but considering 700,000 related to a dewatering project that wasn't budgeted for, we actually outperformed the budget when you don't consider that one project. So overall, with the revenues being higher, the expenses being lower, not considering this 250, the landfill side of things exceeded its budget for the year. On the recycle side of things, again, a very good year for recycling. To the end of November, we had a deficit of about 550,000. We expect it to be about 65,000 for December, giving a deficit for the year of 615,000. Now that compares very favorably when you think that we had actually budgeted to have a deficit of 829,000. And that pretty much, that favorable surplus is all due to the market prices that we're receiving on our commodities right now. The commodity market is hot and we're getting prices that we haven't seen in probably a decade. So our revenue is about 227,000 higher than what we had anticipated it to be when the budget was done. Our expenses are slightly projected to be slightly over, about 13,000, giving a $214,000 favorable variance in recycling. So if I just jump back up here for a second to give you the summary. So before considering the transfers, we were going to be about 99,000. As staff, we are recommending to transfer 150,000 from our capital reserve to cover some of the cell construction costs that we incurred. The budget originally called for a transfer of 250,000. We're only recommending 150,000 because we have outperformed that budget. That would leave an estimated balance in our reserve fund of little over 2 million, and it would give a surplus in the operating fund of just under 250,000. Any questions on the solid waste? I will move on to the last one, which is power generation.
Mary Kay, I was having problems here raising my hand, but
Oh, sure.
the reserve, operating reserves are at $249,000. Our target, if I read it correctly, is 215,000. So are we just putting extra money in there because we feel we might need it? Or am I reading something wrong?
I'm not sure if I'm following you quite right, Peter. Can you just show me where you're reading from?
Well, what you were saying is that this would leave the solid waste capital reserve fund of just a little over 2 million and produce an expected surplus in the operating fund of 249.
Yes, that's right. So the operating fund right now, we're projecting to have about a surplus of 100,000. There's a few unknowns out there right now, which is why we're recommending that additional money come forward. We have two valuations that are being done by our actuary for our retirement allowance and our sick leave. And I can't quantify what that adjustment's going to cost us. So that's why we're recommending the additional 150,000 come in. And it would come in by way of an extra 150 in the operating fund. So we'd have a higher surplus if everything holds. And then that would come into 2023 in our budget, and we get credit for it then.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. So the last fund that we have to look at is Power Generation Fund. And I'm really happy with where Power Generation Fund went in 2021. As you know, it's been a challenging few years for power generation. 2021 was phenomenal as compared to previous years. So if we get into the numbers here, to the end of November, you can see we had a deficit of 20,000. For December, we're expecting or projecting to have a surplus of just under 23,000, which would then produce a year-to-date surplus of just over 2,600. Looking at our revenue, year-to-date, we're at 969,000. We're projecting to be in the range of about 1,080,000. That will be the highest revenue that we've projected since the project began back in 2012, which is really great news. When we did the budget for 2021, we had $80,000 that needed to be transferred from the solid waste operating fund in order to balance this out and produce a balanced budget. We do not need to bring anything over from the operating fund. because it is generating a surplus on its own. So that's great news. On the expense side of things, we did run over with regard to our engines costs. So you can see the maintenance costs were about 62,000. We did have some capital in the range of 61,000, but the additional revenue more than made up for that. So because this surplus is so small, and anything can happen in the next 17, 18 days. I can't predict whether the engines will go down or something could go wrong. What staff is recommending is to take $30,000 out of our power generation capital fund to pay for some of these capital expenditures that would increase our surplus in the operating fund to just over 32,000, and give us a little bit more wiggle room come the end of the year, so that we're not in the position that something comes up and then we're running a deficit for 2021. So that would leave, if we transfer 30,000 from the capital fund reserve fund, it would leave $40,000 to be used in future years. So in summary, there's 3 recommendations that we do have for transfers. The first one is 15,000 from the local planning operating reserve to come into the operating fund to fund that small deficit for the year. The second one being $150,000 from the solid waste capital reserve fund to the solid waste capital fund to fund the cell development costs that were originally called for in the budget in the amount of $250,000. We're only going to need $150,000 for 2021. And then the last one is what we just talked about, is $30,000 from the power generation capital fund to the power generation capital fund for that amount of capital expenditures that were unbudgeted during 2021. Any questions on any of that? Great, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mary Kay. We appreciate the thoroughness that you always have, and it minimizes, I guess, the number of questions we get. Now, I believe all we need to do here tonight is to have a consensus that this go to the board for its resolution. Is that correct, Don?
Yes, it is, Mr. Chair.
Okay, certainly. So we can do that in a number of ways, but why don't I just call off the names and get your thoughts on it? And I'll start with David Duplessis.
Yes, I approve, Peter.
Okay. Stephen Sharp.
In favor.
Ian.
In favor.
Derek.
In favor.
And Greg.
I'm in favor, and I'd like to add that I was overjoyed to hear Mary Kay say that there were only a few things she was concerned with and a few unknowns. I haven't heard such an optimistic appraisal of our local environment in many weeks, and I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, I guess with that behind us, I will call for an adjournment of the meeting.
So
So
moved.
moved, Ian.
Okay. Seconder?